The phone rang at 6:42 in the morning on a Thursday in late March, and the voice on the other end was a man named Carl Whitlock, who owned the dairy operation 3 miles north along County Road 14. Carl was 70 years old and not given to alarm, and that was what made the sound of his voice harder to listen to than the words. "Earl, there's 3 of them parked at the gate of your back 40, yellow ones, Cat 336s. And there's a man with a clipboard standing in your hayfield like he owns it." Earl Mosley set the coffee down without drinking from it. He asked Carl to say it again. Carl said it again. Earl said he'd be there in 20 minutes, and he was, driving the same 1994 Chevy 2500 he'd driven for 31 years, down a gravel road he had ridden in the bed of as a boy beside a grandfather who had taught him the name of every tree along that fence line. 3 bulldozers, a surveyor's truck, a man in a Navy windbreaker with the words Coastal Ridge Holdings stitched across the back in white thread. The man with the clipboard turned around when Earl pulled up, smiled the way a man smiles when he is not going to apologize for anything, and said, "Mr. Mosley, I assume? We're scheduled to break ground at 8. You have until then to remove any personal property from the access easement." Earl Mosley was 76 years old. He lived on 184 acres of bottomland along the Cape Fear River in Bladen County, North Carolina, and the land had been in his family since his grandfather, Otis Mosley, had bought it on a handshake and a $640 down payment in March of 1949. Otis was a sharecropper's son who had worked 22 years in a sawmill before he had enough saved to buy ground of his own, and the man he bought it from was a tobacco farmer named Henry Lipscomb, who had given Otis the deed and a single sheet of paper, written out in pencil, that confirmed the sale and named every fence post and creek bend that marked the boundary. Otis ran the place for 38 years. He passed the land to Earl's father Raymond in 1987, and Raymond ran it for another 22 years before his heart gave out in the south pasture in October of 2009. Earl took it over the same week. He had been working alongside his father since he was 11. He knew the land the way a man knows the back of a hand he has been looking at his whole life. Raymond had said one thing to Earl the week before he died. They had been sitting on the porch, and Raymond had not been a sentimental man, and what he said came out plain. "The deed is in the bank box. The receipt is in your grandfather's toolbox. Don't ever throw out the toolbox. There's things in there that look like nothing and ain't." Earl had not thrown out the toolbox. It sat where Otis had left it in 1989. On the second shelf of the workbench in the basement of the main house, under a canvas tarp that had not been moved in 17 years. Earl had not opened it once. He had not seen any reason to. Raymond had said the deed was in the bank box, and the deed had been enough for 36 years of quiet possession of land no one had ever questioned the ownership of. Until that Thursday morning at 6:42. Coastal Ridge Holdings was not at first a person. It was a letter that had arrived at Earl's mailbox 11 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday in early January, printed on heavy paper with a logo that looked like a wave breaking over a hill. The letter said that Coastal Ridge had purchased a legacy access claim from a regional infrastructure firm called Tidewater Right-of-Way Trust, and that this claim entitled Coastal Ridge to a 60-foot construction easement running diagonally across Earl's back 40 acres for the purpose of installing a buried pipeline corridor. The letter said the easement had been recorded in 1953 and that Earl had 30 days to acknowledge it. Earl had taken the letter to a lawyer in Elizabethtown named Del Harkness, who had read it twice and said, "I don't see anything in your chain of title about this. Let me look into it." Dell had charged him $400 to look into it and had come back 2 weeks later and said the 1953 recording was real, that it had been filed by a now-defunct utility company, and that Coastal Ridge had bought the rights at a portfolio sale in 2023. "Earl, I'm going to be honest with you," Dell had said. "These old easements, once they're recorded, they're hard to fight. You can object, but they have a piece of paper that says they can do this, and they will do this." Earl had asked what his options were. Dell had said the truth was there might not be many. The man with the clipboard at the back gate that Thursday morning was named Bryce Holloway. He was 36 years old. He worked for Coastal Ridge's acquisition arm. He had spent 2 hours total reviewing Earl's parcel before clearing the easement for activation, and he had cleared 11 other parcels in 3 counties that same quarter. Bryce had a quarterly bonus tied to the number of dormant easements he could activate before the fiscal year closed in June. Earl Mosley was the seventh one that month. Bryce did not know Earl's name when he stood in the hayfield. He knew the parcel number. Earl drove home from the back 40 without speaking to Bryce a second time. He told the bulldozer crew they would not be breaking ground at 8, and he told them so without raising his voice. And the foreman of the crew looked at Bryce, and Bryce told the foreman to wait. Earl drove the gravel road back to the main house and walked through the kitchen and down the basement stairs to the workbench under the single bulb his grandfather had hung there in 1958. He pulled the canvas tarp off the second shelf. The toolbox underneath was a dark green steel case, 16 inches long, with a brass latch worn soft from 40 years of opening, and the word Mosley scratched into the lid with a nail. Earl knelt on the concrete floor and unhooked the latch. The hinges made the sound they had made the last time Otis had opened it in 1989. Inside, on the top tray, were the same wrenches and tin snips and pencil stubs that had been there for 50 years. Earl lifted the tray out and set it on the bench. Underneath the tray, folded into the bottom of the box, was a brown leather pouch the size of a man's hand. Earl had not seen it before. He opened the pouch with his thumb. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded once, with pencil writing on it that had not faded because pencil does not fade. It was dated March 14, 1949. It said, "Sold this day to Otis Mosley, 184 acres bottomland, Cape Fear, with all rights of ingress and egress, all surface, all mineral, all water, and all easements present and future, free and clear, with no reservation of any kind. Witnessed and signed, Henry W. Lipscomb." Beneath Henry Lipscomb's signature were two more signatures Earl had not expected. The first was Sheriff Wallace Pruitt of Bladen County, witnessing the sale. The second was Judge Marcus Calloway of the Bladen County Superior Court, who had personally notarized the document and stamped it with the embossed seal of the court. Not a notary's seal, but the seal of the court itself. Earl held the paper under the bulb for a long time. He thought about his grandfather kneeling at this same workbench. He thought about Raymond on the porch. He thought about a March afternoon in 1949 when Otis had walked out of Henry Lipscomb's farmhouse with a deed in one hand and a receipt in the other, and how Otis had taken the receipt to the courthouse the same day and asked the judge himself to put the seal on it, because Otis had grown up watching white men take land back from black men with paperwork that turned out to mean something different from what they had said it meant. Earl set the receipt down on the workbench. He climbed the stairs. He called Dell Harkness from the kitchen phone and told Dell he needed to see him at 9 that morning. And Dell said he had a deposition at 9. And Earl said, "Dell, I think you'll want to move it." Dell Harkness held the receipt under his desk lamp for almost 6 minutes without speaking. He was 67 years old, and he had practiced real estate and title law in Bladen County for 41 years. And that was the kind of man Earl needed. Dell finally set the paper down. He took his glasses off. He looked at Earl and he said, "Earl, do you know what this is?" Earl said he had a notion. Dell said, "No, I don't think you do. Henry Lipscomb sold your grandfather this land in 1949 with a free and clear sale that explicitly disclaimed any reservation of easements present or future. The 1953 recording your friends at Coastal Ridge are relying on, that recording was filed 4 years after Henry Lipscomb had already sold every easement right he owned to your grandfather. Henry Lipscomb couldn't have granted a 1953 easement because he didn't own the easement rights to grant. He sold them in 1949. To Otis, with the seal of the Bladen County Superior Court on the receipt. Earl, this isn't a receipt. This is a court-witnessed conveyance that predates their easement by 4 years. Their easement was filed against land they didn't own the rights to. Earl asked what came next. Dell said the next thing was an emergency motion in the Bladen County Courthouse, and the next thing after that was an injunction. Dell filed the motion at 1:18 that afternoon. The injunction hearing was set for the following Monday morning. Bryce Holloway was instructed in writing not to move equipment onto the parcel until the matter was resolved. Bryce moved equipment onto the parcel anyway, on Friday afternoon, and Coastal Ridge's regional director told him in a phone call that the document Earl had produced was probably a forgery, and that they would settle the question on the merits in court the following week. The bulldozers idled at the back gate all weekend. The Bladen County Courthouse was small and wood-paneled, with an American flag in the corner of the courtroom and the windows cracked open because the heat was working harder than it needed to. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Coastal Ridge arrived first, with 3 lawyers and matching black leather folders and a representative from the parent company in a charcoal suit. Bryce Holloway sat in the second row. Earl arrived at 8:54 with Dell beside him, alone otherwise, wearing a clean shirt and the work boots he had polished at the kitchen table the night before. Judge Eleanor Whitfield took the bench at 9 sharp. She had been a judge in Bladen County for 29 years, and her father had been a judge before her, and she had read every page of every filing the night before. Coastal Ridge's lead attorney, a man named Preston Vance, gave an opening argument that ran for 19 minutes. He talked about the 1953 recording, the chain of portfolio sales, the legitimate expectation of his client, and the nature of dormant easements under North Carolina law. He spoke smoothly. He spoke as if the matter were already decided and the hearing were a formality. Dell stood when his turn came. He spoke for exactly 3 sentences. Your Honor, opposing counsel's chain of title begins in 1953. My client's chain begins in 1949. Their grantor sold the easement rights 4 years before he claimed to grant them. Dell handed the receipt forward. The clerk carried it to the judge. Judge Whitfield held the paper in both hands. She did not speak. She read it once. She turned it over. She read it again, slower. She looked at the embossed seal of the Bladen County Superior Court, and she ran her thumb across it. She set the paper down on the bench. She looked at Preston Vance, and she asked one question. Counselor, was your client aware when they purchased this easement in 2023 that the 1953 grantor had already conveyed all easement rights to a third party in 1949? Preston Vance opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the man in the charcoal suit beside him. The man in the charcoal suit looked at the floor. Preston Vance said, Your Honor, we would request a continuance to review the document's authenticity. Judge Whitfield said, Counselor, the document was authenticated by Judge Marcus Calloway of this court in 1949. I'm not going to continue a hearing to authenticate the work of my own predecessor. The injunction is granted. The easement claim is voided. Coastal Ridge will remove its equipment from the property by sundown today, and damages of $310,000 will be assessed against Coastal Ridge Holdings for unauthorized entry and equipment placement on private land. She brought the gavel down once. She left the bench at 9:34. The Bulldozers were off the property by 4 o'clock that afternoon. The yellow trucks went down County Road 14 in single file, and Earl watched them from the porch without standing up. He sat there for a long time after they were gone. The check from Coastal Ridge arrived 11 days later. Earl deposited it in the same bank his grandfather had used in 1949, which had changed names 4 times in 76 years and was now called something none of the Mosleys would have recognized. He walked out of the bank with the deposit slip folded into his wallet, and he drove home, and he did not say much at supper that night. The next afternoon was a Saturday, and Earl's son Ben drove down from Raleigh, where Ben taught high school history and had been doing so for 16 years. Ben was 44 years old, and he had been on the land every summer of his childhood, and he had asked his father on the phone if he could come walk it with him, and Earl had said, yes, come on. They walked together that afternoon from the house down the long path to the back 40. They walked past the south pasture where Raymond had died, and past the pecan trees Otis had planted in 1956, and past the place where the hayfield met the river. They did not speak the whole way. They reached the fence line at the far edge of the back 40, the one Otis had built in 1951 with cedar posts cut from the property itself, and they stopped there. They stood at the fence for a long time. Ben looked across at the next property over and then back at his father. He didn't ask anything, and Earl didn't say anything, and the silence between them held more than a conversation would have. After a while, they turned and walked back toward the house, the same way they had come, in the same order. The sun was low by the time they reached the porch. Ben sat down in the chair Raymond had built in 1978. Earl sat in the one beside him. They watched the light go. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Somebody who understands that what gets passed down isn't always loud, and that the quiet things are usually the ones that hold. Next story. A 71-year-old widow in eastern Tennessee, a strip mining company, and a survey map her husband drew by hand in 1979 that turns out to be off by exactly 7 feet. And those 7 feet are worth $18 million. Subscribe so you don't miss it. We'll see you there. Paste your script.